The rusted screen door of the old farmhouse groaned like an old grievance, its hinge shedding flakes of orange paint onto the worn cedar floorboards. Clara stood on the threshold, a heavy canvas duffel bag slipping from her shoulder as her gaze swept across the dim, dust-moted expanse of the living room. It was a space suspended in amber, smelling faintly of dried lavender, damp earth, and the distinct, melancholy absence of people who had long since departed. For years, she had carried this house inside her, like a fractured rib, a dull, persistent ache that throbbed whenever the weather turned or life grew too loud. She had fled to the jagged coastlines and frantic neon corridors of the city, believing that distance could serve as a solvent for memory. Yet, memory is a stubborn weed, its roots snaking deep beneath the floorboards of the conscious mind, waiting for the right season to push through the concrete. Now, returning after a decade of self-imposed exile, the silence of the valley did not feel like peace. It felt like an interrogation. The grandfather clock in the hall was dead, its pendulum frozen mid-swing, a stark reminder of the exact moment her world had fractured. Outside, the autumn wind rustled the skeletal branches of the ancient oak, scraping against the glass with a fragile persistence. Clara closed her eyes, drawing in a long, shuddering breath, feeling the heavy, familiar weight of her own history settle back onto her shoulders, wondering if some places are not meant to be left behind, but rather met eye to eye in the quiet wreckage of what used to be. Moving deeper into the house, her fingers trailed along the mahogany sideboard, collecting a fine film of gray ash that coated every surface, like the residue of unlived years. On the wall hung a faded sepia photograph of her grandfather, his eyes crinkled against a sun that had long since set, holding a rusted iron shovel as if it were a scepter. Looking at him, Clara realized how much of her life had been spent running from the very soil that had forged her. In the city, she had built a fortress of professional accolades and polished armor, convincing herself that motion equated to healing. But true healing, she discovered in this breathless stillness, does not happen at high speeds on an interstate highway. It demands pause. It demands that you sit in the dark and listen to the floorboards groan under the ghost of your own making. She walked into the kitchen and found an unwashed ceramic mug sitting beside the porcelain sink, left there the morning her mother had packed her suitcase 10 years ago. A small circle of dried coffee ringed the bottom, dark and stubborn, like an ink stain on a white sheet. Touching the rim, a sudden wave of grief broke over her. Not a sharp, lacerating pain, but a deep, rolling swell that dissolved the hard edges of her defense. It was the realization that she had been mourning not just a person or a place, but the version of herself that died alongside them. A girl who had loved without reservation, before the world taught her how to build walls. As the afternoon sun began to bleed through the dusty lace curtains, casting long amber bars across the warped floor, Clara stepped out onto the overgrown porch. The air outside was crisp, carrying the sharp scent of pine needles and wood smoke drifting from a distant neighbor's chimney. Down by the creek, the water murmured over smooth river stones, a timeless lullaby that had sung to generations before her and would continue long after she was gone. It was in this ordinary, unvarnished moment that the shift occurred, a quiet unspooling of the tight knot she had harbored in her chest. She noticed a lone robin perched on the wooden fence post, tilting its head toward the sky with an unhurried curiosity. The bird didn't fret over the coming winter or mourn the leaves that had already fallen. It simply existed in the pulse of the present. Clara closed her eyes and let the cool autumn breeze brush against her cheeks, feeling the tension slowly drain from her shoulders. For the first time in as long as she could remember, she wasn't calculating her next move or bracing for an imaginary blow. She was simply standing on a porch in the middle of nowhere, breathing in the scent of damp earth and regeneration. The past was no longer a prison sentence. It was an archive of lessons learned through fire and grace. She understood now that the cracks in her spirit were not signs of permanent ruin, but rather the very spaces where the light finally managed to break through. Returning inside as dusk painted the sky in shades of bruised violet and copper, Clara lit a single tallow candle on the kitchen table. The flickering flame cast dancing shadows against the whitewashed walls, pushing back the encroaching darkness with a gentle glow. She opened her duffel bag and pulled out a small, leather-bound journal, the one she had kept locked away at the bottom of her drawer, filled with the raw, jagged entries of a girl who felt entirely abandoned by the universe. Turning the pages, she didn't cringe at the naive heartbreak or the desperate prayers scribbled in the margins. Instead, she looked upon her younger self with a profound, aching compassion, realizing that every tear shed and every sleepless night had been a necessary crucible. We spend so much of our lives waging war against our own scars, she thought, as if by hating our wounds, we could somehow erase the battles that caused them. But the scars are the proof of survival. They are the gold leaf mending of a broken vessel, making it more resilient and infinitely more beautiful, precisely because it was shattered. She picked up a pen and, for the first time in 10 years, added a new sentence to the final page of the journal. It was not a grand epiphany or a dramatic vow, but a simple acknowledgement of peace. I am home, and the storm is finally over. The words felt clean, releasing a reservoir of forgiveness that she had long denied herself. Later that evening, as the stars broke through the blanket of night like scattered diamonds, Clara walked out into the open field behind the house. The crisp air filled her lungs, sharp and invigorating, anchoring her firmly to the earth. She looked up at the vast, indifferent cosmos and no longer felt small or forgotten. She felt connected to the grand, sweeping rhythm of existence. The house behind her was no longer a monument to grief, but a sanctuary of quiet beginnings, waiting patiently for the chapters yet to be written. Healing, she understood now, was not a destination you reached where all pain magically evaporated. It was a daily choice to keep walking forward with an open heart, carrying your history like a lantern rather than a millstone. The wind whispered through the tall grass, a gentle reassurance that the earth always turns toward the light, no matter how long the winter night has been. Tomorrow, she would begin the work of fixing the broken porch steps, painting the faded windowsills, and letting the sunlight back into rooms that had stayed dark for far too long. She stood there for a long time, listening to the magnificent silence of the valley, feeling the steady, unbroken beat of her own pulse. She was bruised, yes, but she was whole, stitched together by time, forgiveness, and the quiet, stubborn grace of a heart that refused to stop loving the world. The autumn wind carried the scent of damp cedar and distant wood smoke across the valley, wrapping the old farmhouse in a blanket of melancholic stillness. Julian stood by the frosted window, watching the amber leaves detach from the ancient oak and drift toward the damp earth below. It had been months since the upheaval, yet the silence inside these walls still felt heavy, echoing with the ghosts of unspoken words and unfulfilled promises. He traced the grain of the wooden windowsill, feeling the roughness of the timber under his fingertips, a tangible reminder of endurance. In this solitary retreat, far from the chaotic rhythm of the city he once called home, time seemed to stretch and dilate. Every creak of the floorboards spoke of a history he was still learning how to release. He had come here seeking escape, but what he found was an unavoidable confrontation with his own shadow. The shadows lengthened across the worn rug as the afternoon waned, painting the room in shades of sepia and gold. He realized that running away was merely a postponement of the inevitable reckoning. The landscape outside, wild and unapologetically resilient, offered a quiet mirror to his fractured spirit. It did not demand perfection. It simply asked him to remain, to breathe, and to witness the slow, unyielding cycle of decay and rebirth. With a soft sigh that fogged the glass, Julian turned away from the window, stepping into the dim hallway, ready to face whatever memory awaited him in the gathering dusk of this long autumn evening. Later, sitting by the hearth, he noticed a small leather journal resting on the mantelpiece, its pages yellowed with age and filled with handwriting that was not his own. Opening it felt like trespassing into a stranger's sanctuary, yet the words inscribed there possessed a strange, haunting familiarity that pierced his armor. The previous owner of the cabin had written about grief, not as an enemy to be vanquished, but as a guest who demanded a seat at the table until its message was fully heard. Julian paused, tears stinging the corners of his eyes as the truth of those dark ink lines settled deep within his chest. For so long, he had fought his own sorrow, treating every ache as a personal failure rather than a natural consequence of caring deeply. The firelight flickered, casting dancing patterns across the floor, illuminating the dust motes that floated lazily in the warmth. He felt a sudden, profound release, as though an invisible knot in his stomach had finally begun to untangle. Grief was not something to fix or erase, but something to carry with tenderness until it transformed into wisdom. He closed the book gently, holding it against his chest like a precious relic, feeling the first genuine pulse of hope spreading through his numb veins. The empty room no longer felt haunted by loss, but rather blessed by the shared human capacity to endure, forgive, and ultimately heal from the inside out, embracing every fragile fragment of his broken yet beautiful life right here on this very quiet autumn night. The following morning broke with a brilliant frost that painted the grass in crystalline silver, coaxing Julian outside into the crisp, invigorating air. Walking down the narrow dirt path toward the edge of the woods, he noticed how the winter birch trees stood tall and stark against the pale blue sky, their white bark scarred with dark, ancient markings. Those scars were not signs of weakness, but proof of survival through harsh, unforgiving winters. A profound realization washed over him like sunlight piercing through canopy leaves. His own emotional scars, which he had hidden away in shame, were actually testaments to his capacity to weather life's storms and remain standing. He inhaled deeply, filling his lungs with the sharp, clean scent of pine and frozen earth, feeling a renewed strength rising from the soles of his feet. The past could not be rewritten, nor could the pain be undone, but its meaning belonged entirely to him. He could choose to view his history as a monument to tragedy, or as a foundation for wisdom and compassion. Turning a stone over in his hand, smooth and cold from the morning chill, he decided that he would no longer carry his burdens as weights that dragged him down. Instead, they would become stepping stones toward a more authentic, grounded existence. The silence of the forest was no longer empty. It was filled with the quiet applause of nature, witnessing a soul reclaiming its own narrative, ready to step forward into the radiant light of a brand new autumn day. Back at the porch, he brewed a cup of black coffee, wrapping his hands around the ceramic mug to absorb its comforting heat. The vapor rose in delicate spirals, dissolving into the crisp air, just as his old anxieties seemed to evaporate into the vast expanse of the valley. He looked across the horizon, where the sun was now crowning the distant ridges, bathing the landscape in an amber glow that chased away every lingering shadow. For the first time in years, he did not feel the urgent need to plan his next move or defend himself against invisible threats. He simply allowed himself to exist in the quiet grace of the present moment. A large golden hawk soared effortlessly overhead, riding the thermal currents with absolute freedom, a living symbol of release and elevation. Julian watched it until it vanished into the clouds, feeling an answering surge of lightness within his own spirit. He understood now that healing was not a destination one finally arrived at, but a continuous practice of returning home to oneself, again and again. Every breath was an invitation to begin anew, untethered from the ghosts of yesterday. He set the empty mug down on the weathered wooden table, feeling a deep, abiding gratitude for the pain that had brought him to this sacred threshold of transformation, ready to embrace whatever gentle rhythm the universe had prepared for his unfolding journey ahead. Right here, in this quiet valley of enduring grace and healing hope. The sun climbed higher into the crisp autumn sky, casting a golden radiance across the entire valley, and signaling the true beginning of Julian's new chapter. He stepped off the porch and walked out into the open field, feeling the cool earth beneath his boots and the gentle breeze brushing against his face. There was no destination in mind, only the expansive freedom of a path waiting to be forged, one deliberate step at a time. He realized that the storms he had survived did not diminish him. Instead, they had cleared away the trivial clutter of his existence, leaving only what truly mattered: love, resilience, forgiveness, and the quiet courage to face the unknown with an open heart. He paused and turned back to look at the little wooden cabin that had sheltered his vulnerability during his darkest hours, offering a silent prayer of thanks to the walls that had held his tears and the journal that had restored his perspective. With a deep, steadying breath, he turned forward again, facing the horizon where the mountains met the endless blue sky. He was no longer running from his past, nor was he hiding from his future. He was fully present, standing in the luminous intersection of grace and possibility, ready to walk into the world as a man made whole by his own willingness to heal, inspired to live every remaining day with fierce compassion, authentic purpose, and unwavering, radiant hope in this beautiful new morning of endless peace and enduring healing light. The autumn air in the valley carried the distinct scent of damp cedar and approaching frost, a heavy stillness that seeped through the weathered timber of the cabin walls. For weeks, Julian had moved through this isolated sanctuary like a ghost haunting its own ruins, tethered to the wreckage of a life left behind in the clamor of the city. Here, beneath the vast canopy of the Oregon pines, time did not heal so much as it congealed, turning every memory into amber. He sat by the frosted window, watching the pale morning light struggle to pierce the thick mist clinging to the riverbank. Every breath felt deliberate, an exercise in endurance rather than living. The silence was absolute, save for the soft groan of the floorboards and the distant murmur of the current over river stones. It was a space carved out of grief, where the noise of ambition and heartbreak finally fell silent, leaving only the raw truth of his solitude. Yet, within this emptiness, a quiet curiosity began to stir beneath the layers of exhaustion. He realized that the isolation he had sought as an escape had transformed into a crucible, a place where the jagged edges of his spirit were no longer protected by distraction, but forced to confront the fragility of what remained. The journey back to himself would not begin with a grand revelation, but with the quiet, terrifying willingness to sit still in the dark and listen to the broken pieces of his own story whispering in the wind. Later that afternoon, driven by an inexplicable compulsion, Julian cleared away the dust from an old pine trunk nestled in the corner of the attic. Inside lay a collection of discarded notebooks and faded photographs from years ago, artifacts of a version of himself he had long since tried to bury. He picked up a leather-bound journal, its pages brittle with age, and turned to an entry written on a bright summer afternoon long before the unraveling began. The handwriting was urgent, filled with bright promises, reckless ambitions, and a profound, innocent faith in the future. Reading those words felt like conversing with a ghost of someone he used to love and deeply understand, yet felt entirely estranged from. A sharp, stinging wave of nostalgia washed over him, accompanied by a heavy grief for the dreams that had withered under the harsh realities of adulthood. He looked at a photograph of himself laughing freely on a sun-drenched coast, completely unaware of the storms gathering on the horizon. In that poignant moment, Julian understood that healing did not mean erasing the past or pretending the wounds had never been inflicted. Rather, it required a tender, radical acceptance of all the flawed, beautiful iterations of who he had been. The boy in the photograph and the broken man by the window were not separate entities. They were bound by the same resilient thread of human vulnerability. By holding space for that younger self, he felt the first true softening around his guarded heart, as if an ancient knot within his chest was finally beginning to loosen. Stepping outside as the afternoon gave way to a bruised twilight, Julian walked down the narrow, pine-needle-strewn path toward the edge of the river. The wind had picked up, carrying the sharp tang of ozone and the deep, earthy breath of the forest floor. He paused near the bank, where a massive, centuries-old oak had been uprooted during a violent winter storm months earlier. Its colossal trunk lay half submerged in the rushing water, a monument to sudden devastation. Yet, as he looked closer, something extraordinary caught his eye. Springing directly from the rotting, fallen bark was a cluster of vibrant green ferns and a sturdy young sapling, drinking in the moisture and thriving amidst the decay. Nature, in its infinite wisdom, wasted nothing. Even the most catastrophic collapse became fertile soil for new beginnings. The sight struck him with the force of an epiphany. For so long, he had viewed his own breakdown as an absolute failure, a dead end where his story had prematurely shattered. But standing beside the fallen oak, he saw the undeniable truth of rebirth. His own life had not ended. It had merely been broken open to make room for something deeper, wilder, and more authentic to take root. The river rushed past, carrying fallen leaves toward an unseen ocean, and with every ripple, he felt a little more of his resistance wash away, replaced by a profound sense of alignment with the natural rhythms of loss and restoration. That evening, under a canopy of emerging stars, Julian performed a quiet, deliberate ritual of release. He gathered a handful of river stones, each one symbolizing a lingering regret an unspoken apology, or a heavy burden of self-blame he had carried across state lines like stones in his pockets. Walking onto the weathered wooden dock that jutted out over the glassy, dark water, he stood motionless, feeling the crisp night air fill his lungs. One by one, he spoke the names of his burdens aloud into the quiet darkness. The guilt of unfulfilled expectations, the bitter ache of betrayal, the relentless perfectionism that had starved his soul. With each confession, he cast a stone into the deep, watching the ripples expand outward until they vanished into the velvet blackness. The sound of each splash was like a door unlocking deep within his consciousness. He realized that the heaviest chains he wore were the ones forged by his own unforgiving expectations. By letting go of the need to control the outcome of his healing, he was finally granting himself the grace to simply be human, imperfect, wounded, yet profoundly capable of love and transformation. Tears blurred his vision, but they were no longer born of sorrow. They were warm, cleansing streams of liberation. Standing there beneath the vast, starlit sky, he felt lighter than he had in years, as if the shadows that had long occupied his soul were finally yielding to the quiet, steady dawn of self-compassion. Dawn broke the following morning with a breathtaking clarity, painting the mountain ridges in strokes of rose, gold, and amethyst. The mist rose from the river in slow spirals, dissolving into the brilliant morning sun as if exhaled by the earth itself. Julian stepped out onto the porch with a cup of coffee, his posture relaxed, his spirit anchored in the strength of the present moment. The cabin no longer felt like a place of exile. It had become a sanctuary of transformation, a crucible where his truest self had been forged from the ashes of despair. He knew the road ahead would still hold challenges, and that sorrow would occasionally return like an old acquaintance. But he was no longer afraid of the dark. He had learned that true healing is not a destination where pain is eradicated, but an ongoing practice of returning to oneself with tenderness and courage. Turning his face toward the warm sunlight, he felt an inspiring surge of hope, a gentle certainty that his story was far from over. The blank pages of his life waited before him. With a steady step and an open heart, he walked down the stairs to meet the morning, ready to re-enter the world as a man made whole, not despite his scars, but because of them, carrying the radiant light of a hard-won peace within his soul. Returning to Crenshaw Avenue on Thursday morning, I pulled my work truck to the curb and stared in quiet disbelief at two folding tables arranged across the front lawn. Cardboard boxes lined the driveway, and a sign taped to the mailbox brazenly declared, "Yard sale. Everything must go." Victoria Sterling stood near the far table, wearing white linen and sunglasses, casually negotiating with a stranger over my late husband's ceramic mixing bowls. My chest tightened as I walked slowly toward the grass, passing Richard's orange-handled pipe wrenches, his spirit levels, and the engraved voltage tester Frank Delaney had gifted him upon retirement. At the far end of the second table, lay a small cedar box crafted by Richard in 1994, its brass latch catching the bright morning sun. Inside rested Richard's wedding band, Lucas's infant hospital bracelet, and handwritten love letters on yellow paper I had not opened since his funeral. "Oh, Audra, we're just doing a little decluttering," Victoria chimed with artificial cheerfulness. Before I could speak, my 72-year-old neighbor, Dolores Reyes, marched across the property line in her floral house dress, her jaw set with 50 years of authority. "That sacred box belongs to Richard's widow, and you have no right touching a dead man's memory," Dolores declared sharply, her eyes cutting through Victoria's polished facade. I picked up the cedar box, holding it tightly against my chest, like a sacred trust. Without acknowledging Victoria's flustered excuses, I walked inside, knowing that preserving love's physical anchors was my first major victory in fully reclaiming my own dignity. 2 days later, Victoria knocked gently on my bedroom door, offering a practiced smile and proposing an afternoon trip to Montage, an exclusive day spa in Beverly Hills. "I feel terrible about the yard sale misunderstanding, Audra," she cooed softly, adjusting her expensive designer handbag. "Let me pamper you with a luxury massage, my treat, so we can spend real time together before the wedding." I agreed, wanting to observe her maneuverings directly. The spa was opulent, filled with polished marble, whispered conversations, and subtle eucalyptus scents. My stiff lower back, aching from long nights spent sleeping in the concrete storage room, welcomed the physical treatment, while my mind remained clear and analytical. Afterwards, as we sat in plush robes sipping cucumber water, a staff member quietly delivered a leather folder containing the bill totaling $840. Victoria opened it, glanced at the receipt, and casually slid the folder across the marble table toward me. "Since you're staying in the house, I thought you'd want to handle this," she remarked smoothly. Looking into her expectant eyes, I folded my hands over my lap, speaking at a clear, measured volume that carried across the lounge. "You explicitly stated this was your treat, Victoria," I stated calmly. "I am not paying $840. If you cannot cover your bill, I suggest you call Derek." Color drained from her face as reception staff turned in silence. Gathering my clothes with composed dignity, I stepped out into the warm afternoon sun, leaving her completely trapped in her shallow deceit. By Friday afternoon, real estate agent Greg Torres arrived to present a binding, written cash offer for the Crenshaw residence. I stood near the backyard lemon tree, the tree Richard and I had planted together 23 years ago, holding its root ball while we debated proper depth, watching gentle sunlight filter through green leaves. "The buyers are Marcus and Denise Webb," Greg explained, handing me the buyer profile. "He's a mechanical engineer at JPL, and she's a pediatric nurse at Cedars-Sinai. They've been searching for 8 months, lost 3 bids to corporate investors, and are offering $950,000 cash with a fast 10-day close." I reviewed their personal letter, filled with sweet photographs of their 6-month-old daughter and heartfelt promises to cherish the garden with genuine care. Denise had specifically written, "When we saw the lemon tree in the backyard, we knew this wasn't just a physical structure. It was a home built with deep love." The offer matched current Los Angeles market valuations perfectly, but more importantly, It resonated with the living pulse of my late husband's memory. Derek viewed our family home merely as a financial lever to impress Victoria's wealthy family. But this young working family recognized its true soul. Looking at the bright yellow fruit hanging from the sturdy branches, I felt a serene sense of completion wash over me. "Accept the offer without counter, Greg," I said softly, signing the purchase agreement with steady cursive penmanship. This house deserves to shelter people who understand that true value is measured in love, not arrogance. Early Saturday morning, my 19-year-old nephew Lucas pulled into the gravel driveway in his old white pickup truck, his face radiating humble character and quiet reliability. Lucas worked long weekend shifts at a local auto shop, restoring vintage engines, possessing the exact same disciplined work ethic and unpretentious spirit that had always defined my late husband, Richard. "Where do we start, Aunt Audra?" he asked, greeting me with a firm, affectionate embrace before carrying heavy wooden boxes from the storage room out to his truck bed. We worked together in comfortable rhythm, moving my personal engineering blueprints, books, and family archives without needing to fill the quiet silence with any idle chatter. At noon, as we sat together on the tailgate eating homemade sandwiches, Lucas walked over to the old lemon tree with sharp shears and small rooting containers. "Uncle Richard showed me how to graft fruit branches when I was 10, Lucas said softly, carefully cutting a healthy, resilient branch with green buds. He planted the sapling cutting into a ceramic pot filled with rich soil, securing it safely in the passenger cab beside the cedar memory box. "This cutting belongs on your new mountain balcony in the Santa Monica Mountains, Aunt Audra," he added, his young eyes bright with wisdom. "Her roots will take hold up there, and she'll bloom again in the clean air." Watching Lucas tend that young sapling, my heart filled with overwhelming gratitude, realizing that true legacy lives not in bitter entitlement, but in the gentle hands of those who respect life's sacred continuity. Following the successful sale of the Crenshaw residence for $950,000, attorney Ray Connors finalized the financial transactions inside his office. After deducting $650,000 to purchase my new mountain sanctuary, $300,000 remained in liquid capital. Rather than hoarding the surplus wealth or allowing it to sit idle, I instructed Ray to establish an irrevocable educational and entrepreneurial trust designated for my nephew, Lucas. Ray drafted the trust documents with meticulous precision, structuring the capital to fund Lucas's business dream of opening an independent vintage automotive restoration shop in Hawthorne. When I handed Lucas the formal trust agreement over coffee that evening, his hands trembled as he read his name listed as sole beneficiary. "Aunt Audra, I can't accept this," Lucas whispered, his voice cracking with emotion. "You earned this money through decades of hard work." I placed my hand gently over his, looking into the honest eyes of a young man who asked for nothing, yet deserved everything. "Lucas, true wealth isn't meant to be clutched out of fear or spent on superficial status," I explained softly. "It is meant to build sturdy foundations for people who walk with genuine integrity. Derek chose shortcuts and deceit, but you chose honest labor and loyalty. You are Richard's true spiritual heir, and this trust is the foundation for your future." As Lucas embraced me warmly, I felt a deep, healing warmth settle into my spirit, knowing that justice was not merely about punishing greed, but about generously nurturing the righteous. The autumn air carried the sharp, sweet scent of crushed pine and damp earth, a familiar breath that seemed to pull the scattered pieces of Julian's spirit back into his chest. Standing at the edge of the old timber porch, where the floorboards groaned under the weight of years and weather, he felt the heavy silence of the valley wrap around him like a worn flannel blanket. It had been nearly a decade since he last walked this path, a lifetime carved out of restless wandering and quiet regrets that echoed in the empty spaces of his mind. The house behind him was no longer just a structure of decaying wood and peeling paint. It had transformed into a silent witness to his endurance, a monument to the resilience of the human heart when it is battered by storms it never asked to weather. He closed his eyes, letting the cool breeze brush against his temples, smoothing away the jagged edges of a grief he had carried across state lines and sleepless nights. Here, at the precise center of where everything had once fallen apart, the ground felt surprisingly solid beneath his boots. There was no theatrical revelation waiting for him, no sudden flash of lightning to rewrite his history. Only the steady, rhythmic pulse of the earth, reminding him that life does not stop because we break. He took a slow, deep breath, tasting the crisp mountain air, and realized, with a quiet, startling clarity, that the ghosts of his past were not monsters guarding the door, but simply a younger self trying to survive. Inside the dusty parlor, shafts of late afternoon sunlight cut through the dimness like golden blades, illuminating the floating motes of dust that danced in the quiet air. Every corner of the room held an artifact of memory, a physical manifestation of laughter shared and tears shed long before the great fracture occurred. On the mantelpiece sat an unmailed letter, its ink slightly faded by decades of sunlight, waiting patiently for words that were never spoken aloud. Julian approached it with a hesitant step, his fingers hovering just above the yellowed paper, as if touching it might summon the past back into roaring, painful life. Yet, as he finally brushed his fingertips against the brittle edge, he felt no sharp sting of betrayal, only a profound sense of compassion for the man who had written those desperate lines so long ago. We spend so much of our lives waging war against our former selves, condemning our past choices as failures, rather than recognizing them as necessary milestones on the road to wisdom. Healing does not come from erasing the scars or pretending the wounds never existed. It blooms quietly in the space where we finally learn to look at our brokenness with tenderness and forgiveness. The room felt lighter now, cleansed by the simple act of acknowledgement, as though the walls themselves were exhaling a collective sigh of relief. He realized that the past is not a prison cell built to keep us trapped, but an old house we must eventually revisit, not to live in, but to lock up. Stepping back outside, he saw a familiar figure walking down the gravel lane. Martha, the neighbor whose quiet steadfastness had anchored the community through its darkest winters. She carried a woven basket filled with freshly picked apples, her steps measured and deliberate, embodying the timeless grace of people who draw their strength from the land itself. When she looked up and caught his eye, there was no awkward surprise or probing curiosity in her weathered face, only the warm, unconditional recognition of someone welcoming a prodigal son back to the fold. They met by the old stone well, where generations of villagers had drawn water, exchanging words that were few but rich with unspoken understanding. Martha handed him a crisp red apple, its skin polished bright, and spoke of how the orchard had survived the late frost, blooming even stronger in the spring. In that simple exchange, Julian understood the deeper truth of human resilience. Healing is never something we achieve in isolation, locked away in our own private towers of sorrow. It requires the gentle touch of community, the shared acknowledgement that every single soul carries a burden and that we belong to one another in our fragility just as much as in our strength. As Martha smiled and continued down the lane, the lingering weight in his chest evaporated completely, replaced by a radiant sense of belonging to the great, unbroken tapestry of human life that endures long after storms have passed, proving that kindness can mend what time alone cannot. As dusk began to paint the western sky in hues of amber and violet, Julian walked down to the edge of the creek where the water babbled over smooth river stones. This was the exact spot where, years ago, he had sat in the suffocating darkness of despair, convinced that his life had permanently fractured beyond any hope of repair. But tonight, as the first evening stars flickered into existence above the ridge, the water sang a different melody, one of continuity and grace. He knelt down, scooping a handful of the ice-cold stream water into his palms and splashed it gently across his face, washing away the dust of travel and the lingering phantom of his long grief. Water has no memory of the stones it beats against. It simply flows onward, embracing every curve of the riverbed, transforming obstacles into music. In that quiet epiphany, he recognized the ultimate secret of healing. We must become like water, willing to bend and yield to the currents of our fate, rather than fighting a losing battle against the things we cannot change. Forgiveness is not something we grant to others as a favor. It is the ultimate liberation we gift to ourselves, freeing our souls from the heavy chains of resentment. He stood up tall, feeling the strength surge back into his limbs, and watched the fading sunlight dance upon the rippling surface of the creek, knowing that his heart had finally found its way home across the quiet valley where peace at last began to breathe inside him. Night fell completely over the valley, wrapping the landscape in a velvet blanket of deep indigo, spangled with countless brilliant stars that seemed to lean down closer to the earth. Julian returned to the porch and sat down on the old wooden steps, feeling no desire to flee or hide from the quietude that enveloped him. The journey he had taken over the past 10 years was not a detour or a waste of precious time, but a necessary pilgrimage through the wilderness of his own soul, teaching him how to cherish the light because he had known the dark. Tomorrow, he would begin the practical work of repairing the house, shoring up its foundations and opening its windows to let the fresh mountain air sweep through every dusty room. But tonight belonged entirely to this sacred transition, the moment when a broken story transformed into a new beginning of profound awakening. He looked up at the vast, indifferent beauty of the cosmos and felt an overwhelming wave of gratitude for every single trial that had brought him safely back to this exact threshold. Life does not promise us an easy road devoid of sorrow, but it offers us something infinitely more precious: the capacity to rise again from the ashes of our greatest heartbreaks, wiser, kinder, and infinitely more alive. With a peaceful smile, he leaned back against the weathered pillar, ready to embrace the coming dawn that promised healing and quiet hope for all the beautiful days that still awaited him in this world so full of grace. The late afternoon sun cast long, amber ribbons across the weathered floorboards of the porch, sketching patterns of memory that no longer held any sting. Standing here, at the exact threshold where so many winters had tested the resolve of his bones, Julian realized how the landscape of grief eventually softens into something resembling grace. The valley below, once viewed through the distorted prism of unfinished losses and unspoken words, now stretched out in quiet, uncompromising clarity. Every ridge and gully told a story of endurance, a silent testament to the resilience embedded in the soil itself. He traced the grain of the wooden railing with a palm hardened by years of quiet labor, feeling the distinct pulse of time, moving neither backward nor forward, but simply settling deep into the present moment. There was a time when this silence would have felt oppressive, a suffocating vacuum echoing with the ghosts of what might have been. Yet, as the autumn wind rustled through the canopy of ancient oaks behind the house, the sound carried no reproach. It was merely the earth breathing, an unhurried rhythm that invited his own shoulders to drop and his breath to deepen. He had spent so much of his life fighting the currents, trying to carve a different destiny out of intractable stone, only to discover that peace arrived unannounced the moment he finally opened his hands and let the river run its course. An entire lifetime of striving dissolved into the simple, radiant truth of simply being alive under the vast, open, indifferent sky. Within that quiet interior space, he found himself turning inward to meet the younger version of himself, that anxious, restless boy who had believed that every mistake was a permanent fracture in his soul. Closing his eyes, Julian could vividly picture that bewildered face standing by the riverbank years ago, clutching onto regrets like jagged stones. With a tenderness he had rarely afforded himself in youth, he reached across the decades to offer an unspoken absolution. It was a profound realization that we spend so much of our existence waging war against our own vulnerabilities, punishing ourselves for not knowing then what we understand only now. He whispered inwardly to that ghost of yesterday, telling him that it was entirely okay to falter, to bleed, and to wander down blind alleys in search of meaning. The scars we carry are not badges of failure, but rather the visible map of a courage that refused to surrender completely to despair. As this inner reconciliation took root, a warm, restorative wave washed over his spirit, dissolving the rigid armor he had worn for so long. Forgiveness, he discovered, was not a grand decree handed down from above, but a slow, quiet surrender of the need for perfection. It was the gentle act of gathering up all the shattered pieces of one's history and recognizing that even in their brokenness, they formed a mosaic of breathtaking. A profound sense of luminous wholeness settled deeply into his weary chest, replacing ancient turbulence with an enduring and utterly unshakable inner peace. True healing, he now understood, did not mean the erasure of pain, nor did it require the fabrication of a flawless past. Instead, it was the courageous expansion of the human heart to hold both sorrow and beauty in the exact same breath. It was found in the mundane rituals of daily life, the way steam rose from a morning ceramic mug, the steady ticking of the kitchen clock, or the familiar smell of rain hitting the dry earth. These ordinary moments were the true anchors of salvation, proving that life continued to offer its quiet gifts long after the grand illusions had faded away. He looked down at his calloused hands and saw them not as instruments of toil, but as vessels that had carried him through storms he once thought would drown him. There was a sacred symmetry to existence, a delicate balance where every tear shed ultimately nourished the seeds of future joy. To live fully meant embracing this paradox without reservation, walking forward with a spirit that was tender yet unbreakable. He no longer feared the shadows because he knew they only existed where light was shining brightly nearby. In this hard-earned wisdom, the world revealed itself not as a battlefield of endless trials, but as a vast, welcoming sanctuary where every weary soul could finally lay down its heavy burden and rest. Finding ultimate peace was never about escaping the wild storms of reality, but rather learning how to dance gracefully within the pouring rain while keeping your heart wide open. Out in the wider world, beyond his private sanctuary, the golden light was beginning to touch the distant mountain peaks, signaling the quiet onset of evening. He thought of all the other travelers journeying along their own unseen paths, each carrying secret hopes and hidden griefs beneath their coats. We are never truly isolated in our suffering, for human fragility is the invisible thread that binds every single one of us together in deep kinship. To share a kind word, to offer a compassionate listening ear, or simply to sit beside another in their darkness was the highest form of redemption we could ever hope to achieve. Julian felt a sudden surge of gratitude for the community that had quietly held him when his own strength had utterly failed. It took immense courage to let others see your wounds, yet that very exposure was precisely where true healing began to flourish. We heal not in solitary confinement, but in the gentle, validating mirror of shared empathy. Every act of kindness offered to a stranger, was a brick laid in the construction of a kinder, more compassionate world. As the evening stars began to flicker one by one into the violet sky, he knew his story was no longer just his own. It belonged to the grand, shared tapestry of human resilience. Carrying this profound realization forward into the quiet night, he felt completely ready to embrace whatever tomorrow might bring with an open, fearless heart that welcomed each new dawn as a miraculous gift of pure grace. Turning away from the wooden railing, Julian stepped back inside his home, feeling light on his feet and entirely at peace with the man he had become. The past was no longer an anchor dragging him down into the murky depths, but a steady compass pointing toward a luminous horizon. He carried the hard-earned wisdom of his journey like a quiet, enduring lantern that illuminated the path ahead with gentle certainty. There were still miles to walk and chapters yet unwritten, but the anxious urgency that had once defined his existence had completely evaporated. Life did not need to be forced or conquered. It simply needed to be lived with reverence, curiosity, and an open soul. He lit a single candle on the kitchen table, watching its warm flame flicker bravely against the encroaching darkness of the room. It was a small, radiant beacon, yet it was more than enough to guide his steps into whatever future awaited him. With a final, lingering look at the tranquil valley resting peacefully beneath the starry heavens, he smiled softly to himself, knowing that after all the long years of searching, he had finally come home to his own true heart. Every single breath he took now felt like a sacred testament to human endurance, a gentle reminder that no matter how long or deep the winter may seem, spring always returns with unyielding devotion, unfurling its green life across the weary earth to awaken every sleeping dream and illuminate the world around him.